Have you ever heard a faint scratching sound in the quiet of night and wondered what small creature was making it? For people centuries ago, such sounds often meant danger, not from wild beasts outside, but from the tiniest intruders inside their homes. Rats crept through granaries, storerooms, and kitchens, searching for food. To families and towns that lived close to the edge of survival, these small invaders were not just nuisances. They threatened the very supply of bread, grain, and vegetables that kept people alive. Hello everyone, and welcome. Tonight we begin a long journey into the hidden history of food and survival, where people faced an enemy that never came with banners or armies, but still laid siege to their daily lives. And if you enjoy uncovering these quieter struggles of the past, you may gently subscribe so that each new story reaches you as faithfully as these voices once reached their listeners. Rats were everywhere. They thrived wherever humans stored food. The problem was not simply the animals themselves, but the fact that food was often stored in ways that made it vulnerable. Grain lay in wooden bins, flour sat in cloth sacks, vegetables were piled in cellars. To rats, these were invitations. Once they found their way in, they chewed through wood, gnawed through fabric, and carried away pieces one by one. Imagine the frustration of waking to find your winter store of grain scattered, the hard-earned harvest spoiled by sharp teeth and restless paws. People quickly learned that rats were clever, persistent, and nearly impossible to banish completely. They could squeeze through cracks no wider than a thumb, climb rough walls, leap surprising distances. The battle was constant, fought with patience and ingenuity rather than brute strength. One of the earliest defenses was simply height. Families raised their food stores above the ground, placing wooden bins or barrels on legs or stone bases. The idea was simple. If food was lifted high, rats would find it harder to climb. Some storerooms even had upright posts topped with smooth, rounded stones, a design that prevented rats from crawling upward. Have you ever seen a bird feeder set on a pole to keep squirrels away? The idea is not new. Centuries ago, people used similar tricks against rats. But rats adapted. They leapt across gaps, clung to edges, and tested every weakness. So people layered their defenses. Barrels were sealed with tight lids, sacks tied with cords, bins lined with harder wood. Still, sharp teeth often won. Those who could afford it sometimes used metal bands around lids or at the base of bins, hoping rats would not chew through iron as easily as wood. Cats are often remembered as rat catchers, but relying solely on them was risky. Not every household kept cats, and not every cat was a skilled hunter. Some ignored the scratching in the dark entirely. So while animals sometimes helped, humans had to invent strategies of their own. One strange but common method was the use of strong smells. People discovered that rats disliked certain odors. They scattered herbs like mint or tansy near storerooms, hoping the scent would drive the rodents away. Some hung bundles of dried plants from rafters, creating invisible walls of smell. Imagine walking into a cellar not only filled with food, but thick with the aroma of herbs, sharp and persistent, chosen less for taste than for defense. Another defense was noise. People banged pans or shook rattles near suspected nests, driving rats from corners. While this worked only briefly, it bought time. Rats fled, startled, and in those moments food could be shifted, bins checked, and damage repaired. Perhaps most curious were the traps. Before metal springs or complex devices, traps were often simple pits, buckets, or weighted lids. A common trick was to balance a board on a barrel filled with water, baited with grain at the far end. When the rat crossed, the board tipped and the rat fell in. These traps were crude, sometimes cruel, but they reflected the desperation of people trying to save their food. Why did people go to such lengths? Because food was survival. Every bite saved from rats meant a family had a better chance of lasting through winter. A few chewed sacks could mean hunger, illness, or worse. The fight against rats was not just about cleanliness, it was about life itself. So why tell this story now? Because it reveals how much effort people poured into the smallest details of survival. While kings ruled and wars raged, ordinary families fought quieter battles each night, scratching against scratching, guarding their food with tricks, patience, and persistence. And what lesson rests in these shadows of pantries and granaries? That history is not only shaped by great events, but by small, persistent struggles like the endless attempts to keep food safe from rats. Have you ever hidden a snack in your home, only to find someone else discovered it before you? For families long ago, the someone else was often not a person at all, but a rat. Protecting food was as much about the container as it was about the food itself. If rats could not reach it, they could not ruin it. And so people became inventors of boxes, barrels, and bins, turning simple storage into a constant experiment in survival. Wood was the most common material. Carpenters built large chests for grain, their thick planks nailed tightly together. Some had lids that closed flush, sealed with heavy iron hinges. The goal was not beauty, but resilience. Wood strong enough to resist gnawing teeth, lids heavy enough to resist prying paws. Yet rats, clever as ever, learned to search for weak points. A crack in the corner, a knot in the wood, a seam not hammered tightly. All could be widened with persistence. To answer this, people began lining containers. Clay was smeared along edges, hardening into a shell. Ash was packed between boards, discouraging gnawing. Some even coated the insides with tar or pitch, making the wood slick and bitter to chew. These were not elegant solutions, but they turned barrels into fortresses, where food could rest more safely than in sacks or baskets. Stone bins offered stronger protection still. In some regions, families carved shallow pits in cellars and lined them with stone, stacking sacks within. Rats struggled to dig through stone walls, and the smooth surfaces gave them little purchase to climb. Have you ever seen a jar so heavy you knew it could not be opened by accident? Stone bins carried that same promise of safety. Metal was rarer but valuable. Wealthier households sometimes banded barrels with iron hoops, not just for strength, but for defense. Rats found iron unpleasant against their teeth. Some chests had lids rimmed with thin plates of copper or tin, discouraging gnawing along the edges. Though expensive, these touches often meant the difference between grain lost and grain preserved. Smaller containers were just as important. Cheese was wrapped in cloth and dipped in wax, sealing it from pests. Butter was packed in crocks and buried in cool earth, the lid weighted with stone. Meat, when stored, was hung from hooks, safe from teeth below. Vegetables were packed in straw within crates, each layer another barrier. Every kind of food called for its own kind of container, a careful matching of material to vulnerability. The constant challenge was cost. Not every family could afford barrels with iron hoops or bins lined with stone. Many relied on simpler measures, raising containers on platforms, sealing lids with clay, tying sacks with rope. Even these helped, slowing rats and forcing them to search elsewhere. Containers also had to balance defense with convenience. A bin too tightly sealed slowed not only rats but people. Families needed to open them daily, scooping grain or flour, and too much difficulty turned safety into frustration. The best solutions were those that resisted rats, yet still allowed human hands to move easily. These containers tell us much about the daily rhythm of life. They show how people poured time and effort into safeguarding what they had grown, harvested, or purchased. They reveal a quiet truth that survival often depended not on grand inventions, but on simple boxes built stronger, lids sealed tighter, and barrels made harder to chew. So why did people devote such care to their containers? Because food was precious, and rats were relentless. Every bin or barrel was not only storage, but defense, a silent guardian standing between hunger and survival. Have you ever tried putting something on a shelf just high enough to keep it away from curious hands or paws? Centuries ago, families learned that height was one of the simplest defenses against rats. If food was lifted above the ground, rodents had to work harder to reach it. And so, homes, barns, and storehouses filled with raised platforms, hanging hooks and suspended baskets, each one a small fortress in the battle to protect food. Granaries often stood on posts. Their wooden floors were lifted well above the soil, leaving open air beneath. Some posts were topped with smooth, rounded stones, barriers that rats could not climb over. The design was simple but effective. The creatures could scurry up rough wood, but when they reached the stone cap, their claws slipped. Have you ever tried climbing something perfectly smooth, with nothing to grip? For rats, these stone-topped posts were unclimbable walls. Inside homes, families used similar tricks. Food was hung from rafters in sacks or baskets, swinging just out of reach. Hooks and beams bore the weight of cheese wheels, smoked fish, or bundles of grain. The movement itself discouraged rats. The moment they tried to leap, the basket swung away. People understood that even small motions could turn a tempting prize into an impossible goal. In some places, ropes and pulleys allowed food to be hoisted higher still. A sack tied to a rope could be lifted after meals, dangling in the air until morning. It was not elegant, but it was clever. Each evening became a ritual, lifting food into the air, listening for the creak of the pulley, knowing that the night would be safer with supplies out of reach. Raised shelves lined with smooth boards added another barrier. Rats could climb walls, but found it difficult to scale shelves without footholds. Families built wide ledges, polished with sand or ash until slick. The shelves shone not only with use, but with intent, each one a hidden wall against tiny invaders. Even outside, raised storage mattered. Farmers built platforms in fields, setting baskets of harvested crops above ground while they worked. This kept supplies safe until they could be carried home. Hunters hung meat high between trees, leaving it beyond the reach of sharp teeth below. Wherever food paused, people found a way to lift it higher, turning height into defense. Of course, rats adapted. They leapt from beams, climbed ropes, and sometimes gnawed through cords. Suspended food was not invulnerable, but it slowed the attack. Every obstacle gave families more time, more chances to guard their stores. The war with rats was not won with absolute victories, but with small delays, enough to make survival possible. Raised platforms also carried symbolic weight. They showed how much people valued their food, how carefully they guarded it. Each lifted sack was a sign of labor protected, a season's harvest defended against ruin. Have you ever locked a door not because you expected danger, but because you valued what was inside? Raised storage carried that same quiet intention. So why did people hang, lift, and raise their food? Because gravity itself became an ally. In a world where rats scurried freely across floors and fields, height offered a fragile but vital shield. It turned ceilings, posts, and beams into sentinels, guarding food 1 inch at a time. Have you ever noticed how certain scents drive you away while others make you linger? People centuries ago paid close attention to smells, not just for cooking or comfort, but for defense. Rats with their sharp noses disliked many strong odors, and so families turned to herbs and pungent materials as invisible shields against gnawing invaders. The story of how households layered their storerooms with smells is one of persistence and creativity, a quieter weapon in the long fight against rats. Mint was among the favorites. Families scattered leaves along the corners of storage rooms, crushed them into floors, or tucked them into cracks. The sharp freshness filled the air, pleasant to people, but unsettling to rodents. Bundles of dried mint hung from rafters, swaying gently with drafts, their scent slowly released. Have you ever stepped into a room heavy with a single smell? For rats, that was enough to turn them away. Tansy was another herb widely used. Its bitter odor was said to repel pests of many kinds. People gathered it in bunches, drying it and hanging it near sacks of grain. Some ground its leaves and sprinkled the powder along thresholds. The goal was not to kill, but to discourage, to make the pantry unwelcoming. Strong woods played their part, too. Cedar, with its lasting fragrance, lined some chests. Boxes carved from it became prized containers, not only for clothes, but for food. Rats disliked its penetrating scent, and so cedar earned a place as both material and repellent. Ashes left from hearth fires were also scattered. Their dryness irritated small paws, and their faint odor masked the smell of food. By layering ashes near storage, families created barriers both physical and olfactory. The sight of a pale dusting at the edge of a room was not neglect, but protection. In some regions, people used lime or chalk dust, not only to seal cracks, but to confuse scent trails. Rats often followed the smell of grain. Masking it delayed their discovery. A messenger of food might never reach the invader's nose, leaving the pantry safe a little longer. Perhaps the strangest repellents were those drawn from daily life. Families left onion skins piled in corners, their pungency lasting long after the bulbs were eaten. Some even placed cloths soaked in vinegar near sacks, the acrid smell sharp enough to drive away sensitive noses. These measures may not have been pleasant to humans either, but hunger made them tolerable. Better to live with strong odors than to face empty bins. The layering of scents reveals an important truth, that people experimented endlessly. Some herbs worked better in summer, others in winter. Some repelled briefly, others lingered. There was no single solution, only combinations adjusted to conditions. Have you ever tried several tricks to solve a problem, not knowing which would work until one finally did? That was a constant process of defending food with smell. And while not every method succeeded, the effort mattered. Each hanging bundle of mint, each scattered ash, each pungent rag marked an act of protection. Together they formed an unseen wall, reminding us that defense is not always made of stone or wood. Sometimes it is as soft as a leaf, as light as dust, as fleeting as a scent carried on the air. So why did people fill their storerooms with strange smells? Because they learned that rats, with their sensitive noses, could be turned away by odors alone. And though the air grew sharp, the food beneath it remained safe, and that was worth every breath of bitterness. Have you ever noticed how a single glance from a watchful animal can change the behavior of everything around it? Birds scatter when they spot a hawk, and mice freeze when a shadow falls across the ground. For centuries, people relied on this same principle to defend their food. While cats are the most famous guardians against rats, the story is broader than that. Dogs, ferrets, even owls played their parts. Yet none were perfect, and so households had to balance animal help with their own vigilance. Cats earned their place first. Agile, patient, and keen-eyed, they stalked in silence. The mere scent of a cat could send rats scurrying elsewhere. Farmers welcomed them into barns, townsfolk kept them near storerooms, and travelers valued them in inns. But cats were not tools. They were companions with their own moods. Some hunted fiercely, others lazed by the fire. A family never knew whether their cat would be a relentless guardian or a quiet observer who ignored the scratching in the walls. Dogs, too, served as deterrents. While not as nimble in chasing rats, their presence and barking discouraged pests. Larger breeds patrolled yards, scaring away both intruders and rodents. Smaller dogs were sometimes trained to dart into holes, pulling rats out with quick bites. These roles varied by place and purpose, but the theme was the same. Animals were woven into human defenses, part of the living barrier between food and hunger. Owls offered another form of protection. Barns with open rafters often sheltered these silent hunters, who feasted on rodents at night. People tolerated them, even encouraged them, knowing that fewer squeaks in the dark meant more grain left untouched. The partnership was unspoken but valuable. Humans provided shelter, and owls kept balance. Yet reliance on animals was never enough. Cats slept, dogs tired, owls hunted elsewhere. Families quickly learned that no creature could guard food constantly. Have you ever trusted someone to watch over something important only to find they grew distracted? That was the risk of animal guardianship. The watchful eyes turned away, and in that moment, rats returned. This is why people always combined animal help with their own tricks. Raised platforms, barrels, smells, and traps. The animals were partners, not solutions. Their presence bought time, their hunting reduced numbers, but human ingenuity remained necessary. Even today, we sometimes smile at images of cats curled in barns, imagining them as tireless hunters. The truth was more complicated. They were part of the battle, but never the whole. And just as you are listening to this calm unfolding of history, consider how each chapter of survival was built on layers, animal and human together, patience and invention, side by side. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into forgotten struggles, you may gently subscribe so that each new story finds its way to you as faithfully as these memories reach us now. So why did people rely on animals, even knowing they could not solve everything? Because a pair of eyes, a sharp nose, and a sudden pounce could mean the difference between a full pantry and a spoiled one. And in the endless war with rats, even imperfect guardians were worth keeping close. Have you ever waited in silence, knowing that something would happen only if you stayed still long enough? That is the essence of a trap. It works not by speed or strength, but by patience. Centuries ago, people built traps to catch rats before they could ruin food. These devices, often simple in form, reflected a deep understanding of persistence. If the rats came night after night, then the trap could wait just as long. The earliest traps were crude but clever. A bucket half filled with water was placed beneath a narrow board. Grain or crumbs lured the rat onto the board, which tipped under its weight, sending the creature tumbling into the bucket. The trap required no constant attention, only setup and patience. Each morning the family checked the bucket to see whether the night had claimed a thief. Other traps used balance differently. A heavy lid rested on a thin stick, propped open with bait inside. The moment the rat pulled at the food, the stick shifted and the lid slammed shut. The idea was simple. Curiosity became the enemy and hunger the bait. In barns, larger traps were made with cages. A sliding door dropped once a rat entered, locking it inside. These cages often caught several at once, a grim but effective way to protect grain. Farmers grew skilled at crafting them from wood, wire, or even woven reeds. The sound of the door slamming shut became a small victory in the nightly war. But traps required more than building. They demanded patience and placement. People learned where rats moved, how they searched, where they gnawed. Traps placed in wrong corners sat empty, no matter how clever. Traps placed along trails, beside walls, or near holes filled quickly. Have you ever tried solving a problem only to realize that timing and location mattered more than effort? That was the wisdom of trap makers. Patience guided the hand, not haste. Not all traps relied on mechanics. Some used sticky substances, spreading tar or pitch along boards where rats traveled. Once caught, the animal could not escape. These methods were harsh, but they revealed the desperation of people who could not afford to lose food. Traps also carried lessons for communities. One household's effort reduced numbers for neighbors too. In villages, people sometimes set traps together, lining barns and granaries with defenses. The community watched as the piles of captured pests grew, and with them relief that the harvest might last a little longer. And yet, traps were never perfect. Rats learned. They avoided certain corners, skipped over certain smells, grew cautious of anything unfamiliar. Trap makers adapted in turn, changing designs, shifting placements, adding new baits. The battle was one of wits, drawn out over generations. So why did people devote such patience to trap making? Because food was too valuable to leave unguarded. Each device represented hope that tonight the gnawing would be fewer, the grain safer, the family more secure. In the stillness of barns and storerooms, the trap maker's patience echoed. Silent boards balanced, lids propped, cages waiting. The people slept, but their inventions kept watch, proving that even in the quietest hours, human ingenuity never rested. Have you ever stood in front of a door and felt the weight of everything it protected behind it? For many families and whole villages long ago, that door was the entrance to the granary. Inside lay the harvest that promised survival through winter, the food that would feed children, sustain workers, and keep the household alive until the next season's fields ripened again. That granary was not just a storeroom. It was the heart of security, the anchor of hope, the quiet vault where days of labor were transformed into months of nourishment. And because of that, it was a constant target for the clever, restless creatures that crept in the night. The battle for the granary was not waged with armies, but with wood, stone, vigilance, and patience. Granaries could be small or large, humble or impressive. A poor family might use nothing more than a sturdy chest in the corner of a cool room, while wealthier households or villages might maintain entire buildings with thick walls and heavy doors. But no matter the size, each shared a common enemy, the rat. Rats did not care about the dignity of labor or the weight of hope behind those walls. To them, a granary was simply a treasure trove of food, and their senses guided them to it with unerring precision. They could smell grain through cracks, hear the shuffle of kernels inside bins, and recognize opportunities hidden to human eyes. The first line of defense was always the walls. People quickly learned that flimsy structures could be breached easily. Wooden planks alone were not enough, for rats' teeth could chew through them with time. Families tried to reinforce them with thicker beams, staggering the seams so that no straight crack provided a path. They coated the insides with clay, smoothing it until no paw could gain a grip and no nose could sniff directly at the grain. Others smeared plaster across gaps, sealing them in pale, hardened layers that told rats, this far, no farther. But the fight never ended, because teeth could gnaw, cracks could grow, and diligence had to match persistence. Stone was better. Where it was available, families or communities built granaries from blocks fitted carefully together. These looked more like miniature fortresses than storehouses. Rats could not easily chew through stone, but they searched for tiny gaps. Even the smallest hole became a potential tunnel. People understood that the battle was as much about vigilance as material. Inspecting those walls became a ritual. Every week, sometimes every day, hands ran along corners, eyes searched for chips, ears listened for the faint echo of burrowing. To guard food was to pay attention constantly. Floors presented their own dangers. When bins or barrels rested directly on the earth, rats tunneled up from below. People learned this quickly, sometimes after devastating losses. They adapted by raising floors on stone foundations, lifting the entire structure away from the soil. Others packed earth into hard clay, pounding it until it was nearly as solid as rock. Some even mixed lime into the surface, creating a sharp deterrent to teeth. A floor that could not be tunneled through was as important as a wall that could not be climbed. Doors were the most obvious weakness. They had to open and close to allow people in, and so they were used endlessly. Each swing loosened the frame a little, each slam widened a seam. Rats noticed every change. To stop them, carpenters crafted doors that overlapped tightly, pressing against thresholds banded with iron strips. Families latched them carefully at night, not only against human thieves, but against the smaller intruders who required no tools. A loose hinge could undo months of harvest. A gap no wider than a thumb could become an invitation to disaster. Windows, too, created risk. Some granaries had them for air and light, but each opening was another pathway. People wove reed screens across them, or hammered thin metal sheets with small holes, allowing air to flow but barring passage. These screens had to be checked constantly, because rats never stopped testing them. A single weak reed might be gnawed through in a night. So patching became another ritual, a task handed down like sweeping or washing. In many regions, people solved the problem differently. They raised the whole granary off the ground. Imagine a barn on stilts, its body lifted above air, supported by stone or wood posts. Beneath it, shadows stretched across open space, denying rats their usual hiding places. At the tops of the posts, people placed smooth, flat stones, sometimes carved into discs, sometimes natural slabs. These acted as barriers. A rat could climb the post, but once it reached the stone, its claws slipped, its body slid, and the path ended there. Raised granaries became almost graceful to look at, their designs born not of ornament, but of sheer necessity. But no matter how clever the construction, the greatest defense was always human presence. Families knew that someone had to watch. Granaries were not locked and forgotten. They were checked, guarded, and cared for. Children learned to recognize the faint rustle of rats, to wake their elders if they heard it. Elders themselves sometimes sat nearby in silence, listening through long nights. In villages, neighbors shared the duty, taking turns to ensure the community's stores remained safe. Grain was more than private wealth. It was the lifeblood of everyone. One household's loss could ripple outward, weakening the strength of all. Inside the granary, traps waited. Buckets of water balanced with planks, lids propped with sticks, cages ready to drop at the faintest nudge. People set them carefully, baiting them with crumbs or kernels. Each morning brought a new inspection. Were the traps sprung? Were the intruders caught? Was the grain still safe? Children helped reset them, learning the designs, passing the knowledge forward. These lessons were not taught in books, but in the steady rhythm of survival. Failures happened, and they hurt. Sometimes families opened the door to find sacks shredded, grain scattered, droppings littering the floor. The smell of waste and loss carried despair. Imagine working in the fields, sweating under the sun to harvest, thresh, and carry each sack, only to see it ruined by teeth and claws. Tears fell in granaries as often as laughter. The battle was never without defeats. Yet each defeat led to adaptation. Stronger walls, tighter lids, new traps, people responded with resilience. Communities built entire traditions around defense. At harvest time, when the granary was fullest and the risk greatest, they redoubled efforts. Groups gathered to repair walls, line cracks, scatter herbs, and set traps. The granary became not just a storeroom, but a symbol of shared survival. It told every villager, this is what we must protect together. And in those moments, the granary was more than wood, stone, and grain. It was a promise. A full bin meant reassurance. It meant meals through the dark months, strength through lean days, hope through long winters. To defend it from rats was to defend life itself. Every nail hammered, every crack sealed, every trap set was an act of endurance. The battle for the granary was never finally won. Rats returned, season after season, generation after generation, but so did the people. They watched, they repaired, they adapted. They lost some battles, but saved enough to carry on. Their persistence is why their stories survive, why their children endured, why their villages stood. And so when we look back, the lesson of the granary is clear. Survival was not only about fields and harvests, but about storage and protection. It was not only about growing food, but about keeping it safe. The granary was the heart of that struggle, the fortress against hunger, the place where hope was stacked in sacks and barrels. It stood not in silence, but in constant vigilance, whispering the truth that even small battles, scratch against hammer, tooth against stone, trap against claw, shape the course of human endurance. Have you ever lain awake in the stillness of night when the world grows so quiet that even the faintest sound carries across the room? In those hours, every creak of timber, every soft rustle of straw, every flutter of a moth against the wall becomes magnified. For families centuries ago, there was one sound above all that stirred both dread and alertness, the scratching of tiny claws in the dark. That noise meant the enemy had returned, slipping silently into storerooms, pantries, and granaries. It meant food was under attack, and because food meant survival, those small noises called people from their beds, urging them into wakefulness, vigilance, and action. The night belonged to rats. During the day, human footsteps, voices, and work kept them wary. They hid in holes, nests, and shadows, waiting for stillness. But when the last candle was snuffed, when tools lay silent and the household slept, the rats emerged. Their bodies slid through cracks barely visible. Their noses twitched at faint scents of grain, and their claws tapped across boards. To the human ear, the sounds were small. To the human heart, they were loud, because they announced danger at the most vulnerable hour. Families learned to listen. Children were trained to recognize the difference between the harmless squeak of wind in beams and the determined gnaw of teeth against wood. A faint rhythmic scraping, slow and insistent, often signaled that a rat was testing a corner. A quick burst of scurrying across a floor hinted at one darting between shadows. A chorus of light taps could mean more than one working together. These sounds became a second language, read and understood in the stillness of night. To guard food required wakefulness. People accepted that rest was often broken. Some households set one member to keep watch for part of the night, then another to take their place. It was not a comfortable duty. Eyes strained in dim light, ears rang with imagined noises, minds fought the heaviness of sleep. Yet it was necessary. A single night of inattention could lead to chewed sacks, spilled grain, and the heartbreaking discovery of waste in the morning. Light was both friend and danger. A lantern flickered enough to startle rats, driving them back into holes, but too much flame near grain risked fire. Families compromised, keeping only faint glows, enough to cast shadows and unsettle intruders, but not enough to endanger stores. Some used embers in covered lamps, the faint red warmth glowing like watchful eyes. Others trusted the moon, arranging storerooms where its silver beams cut through small windows, leaving patches of brightness on the floor. The light itself became part of the defense, an ally against creatures that preferred shadows. Noise was another tool. When scratching grew loud, families struck the floor with sticks or clapped wooden boards together. The sudden thud echoed, startling the rats into flight. For a moment, silence returned, but rats were persistent. They waited until the sound faded, then crept forward again. So people learned that vigilance was not a single act, but a repeated rhythm, carried out again and again, hour by hour. Some households kept simple tools by their beds, sticks, stones, or small clubs. If a rat appeared bold enough to cross open space, a swift throw or strike could end the intrusion. Children sometimes told stories of their elders leaping up at night, weapon in hand, chasing a rat from the pantry. The image was almost comical, yet it reflected a serious truth. To protect food was worth any inconvenience, even if it meant stumbling half asleep across a cold floor to drive out a thief no larger than one's hand. Communities, too, developed habits of vigilance. In villages where granaries stored food for many families, watch shifts were common. One or two people stayed near the building at night, sometimes with dogs at their side, listening for movement. Their presence mattered not only for chasing away rats, but for discouraging human thieves as well. Villagers knew that the quiet hours were the most dangerous when both kinds of intruders found their courage. The night brought not only danger but also learning. People observed how rats behaved when undisturbed. They saw which corners they favored, which sacks they gnawed first, which paths they used. These observations shaped future defenses. Traps were placed where scurrying feet had been heard. Cracks were patched where gnawing had echoed. In this way, vigilance was more than protection. It was study, a careful listening to the enemy's tactics. Fear played its part. Children often confessed to being unsettled by the sounds. The faint gnawing at walls seemed larger in the imagination, as if the very structure of the home might collapse under the hidden invasion. Parents soothed them, but they too understood the unease. To lie in darkness knowing something worked steadily against you was to feel exposed. And yet, instead of surrendering to fear, families turned it into attention. They accepted the noise as a call, not to panic, but to act. The pattern of vigilance shaped daily life. Because nights were broken, days moved more slowly. Work in fields was done with weariness, eyes heavy from interrupted sleep. Yet the rhythm became normal. Just as people accepted the seasons of planting and harvest, they accepted the nights of watchfulness. Survival required adaptation, and so they adapted. In stories passed down, some families even gave names to the most troublesome rats, as if acknowledging them turned fear into familiarity. A particularly bold rat that returned night after night might be called the Gnar, or the Shadow. Children whispered about them, adults cursed them, and traps were set with those specific enemies in mind. It was a way of turning a shapeless threat into something concrete, easier to face. The greatest lesson of night vigilance was endurance. No matter how many times the scratching returned, people rose to answer it. No matter how many sleepless hours passed, the defense continued. They did not expect to win permanently, but they refused to lose entirely. Each sack saved was victory enough. Each night survived was another step toward the future. So why tell this story of night noises and broken sleep? Because it reminds us that survival often depends not on grand acts of heroism, but on the quiet persistence of ordinary people. The battle was not fought with swords or banners, but with listening ears, steady hands, and the willingness to rise again and again to face the same small enemy. In the endless dark, the vigilance of humans matched the persistence of rats, and though the war was never ended, it was fought with courage that deserves remembrance. Have you ever faced a problem so persistent that you felt as though you were playing a game with no end, where every move you made was answered by an opponent who never tired? For people long ago, rats were exactly that kind of opponent. The battle to keep food safe was not about a single clever trick or one decisive act. It was a long game of ingenuity, patience, and adaptation. Every time humans invented a defense, rats found a way around it. And every time rats broke through, humans invented again. The rhythm of survival was not victory or defeat, but endless response. Granaries, cellars, kitchens, and storerooms became testing grounds for invention. Families learned to combine methods, layering them together so that no single weakness invited disaster. A raised bin alone might fail, but paired with a heavy lid, a scattering of herbs, and a well-placed trap, it might hold firm. The wisdom lay not in relying on one solution, but in weaving many into a fabric of defense. This constant game demanded creativity. People who had little formal education became experimenters. They tested which woods resisted gnawing, which herbs drove rats away, which traps caught them most effectively. Their discovery spread slowly from neighbor to neighbor, village to village, becoming part of shared memory. Have you ever tried solving a small household problem with whatever materials were at hand, only to stumble on a solution that felt ingenious in its simplicity? That was the spirit of these defenses, practical, inventive, born of necessity. Sometimes the ingenuity was architectural. Families altered the shapes of their storage buildings, making walls curve outward so rats could not climb, or building ledges too smooth to grip. They placed bins on stone slabs polished until they gleamed, their slickness denying footholds. They built compartments within compartments, so that even if one was breached, the others remained safe. Each design carried the mark of thought sharpened by desperation. Other times the ingenuity lay in small objects. Traps grew more sophisticated, using balance, counterweight, and tension. Farmers crafted them from scraps of wood and bits of metal, experimenting until the mechanism sprang cleanly. These devices were not always reliable, but when they worked beautifully, turning the rat's curiosity into its downfall. Some families grew almost proud of their traps, boasting that theirs caught more than a neighbor's, as if competition meant energy to survival. Even smells became tools of invention. People tested endless combinations of herbs, roots, and ashes. If mint alone failed, perhaps mint mixed with vinegar worked better. If cedar chips lost their strength, perhaps fresh shavings renewed it. They layered scents, replaced them regularly, and noted which worked best in which seasons. The granary became not just a storehouse, but a kind of laboratory, where necessity guided experiment. All this effort reveals something deeper about human nature, the refusal to give up. Rats multiplied faster, chewed stronger, and endured hardships better than most creatures. Yet humans matched them with thought, will, and imagination. It was not brute strength that gave people an advantage, but the capacity to adapt, to change strategies again and again. And as you listen to this story of endless invention, perhaps it is a good moment to pause. These quiet battles of survival may seem small, but they remind us that history is not just made by grand events. It is also shaped by persistence in the face of small, stubborn challenges. If you enjoy discovering how ordinary people met these struggles with creativity, you may gently subscribe so that each new journey into the overlooked past finds its way to you as surely as these stories once traveled from generation to generation. Returning to the story, what stands out most is not that rats always returned, but that people never stopped resisting. Even after losses, even after sleepless nights, they kept trying. They patched, they built, they scattered herbs, they set traps. Each effort mattered, not just for the food saved, but for the sense of control it gave. To act was to hope, and to hope was to survive. The endless game of ingenuity continues even now in different forms. Modern solutions may look different: sealed containers, reinforced buildings, clever devices, but the principle remains the same. Wherever food is stored, vigilance follows. The story of long-ago households is part of a much larger truth. That survival is always a conversation between human invention and the forces that test it. And so the scratching in the night, though it may have carried dread, also carried meaning. It was a signal that the game was still on, that people and rats still faced each other across the invisible board. The people answered with thought, the rats with persistence. No final move ended it, but each night played out another round in the timeless match. And while the rats often seemed to win, the people endured season after season, harvest after harvest, proving that persistence of mind could match persistence of tooth and claw. Have you ever noticed how the smallest tasks, repeated day after day, can wear on you more than the greatest efforts done once? The great harvests of the year were exhausting, but they ended with relief and celebration. The constant defense of food against rats, however, never ended. It crept into every night, every errand, every chore. Over time, this endless vigilance left its own mark, not only on food supplies, but on people themselves. The work began long before the scratching of rats was heard. Families prepared storerooms with care, lining walls, raising bins, sealing lids. The labor seemed invisible compared to the bustle of fields or markets, but it consumed time. A father might spend hours hammering iron strips into a door frame. A mother might patch cracks with fresh clay, smoothing the surface until her hands ached. Children might scatter herbs, their noses stinging from the sharp scents. The defenses built up slowly, quietly, as if constructing a fortress whose walls would never appear in paintings, but whose strength determined survival. Then came the nights of watching. One evening lost to interrupted sleep was bearable, but night after night, week after week, the weariness accumulated. Eyes grew heavy, tempers frayed, and mistakes multiplied. A latch was not checked, a trap not reset, a crack left unpatched. The smallest oversight could undo weeks of care. People spoke of the fatigue as if it were another enemy, as persistent as the rats themselves. Hunger threatened from one side, exhaustion from the other. The constant fear of loss weighed heavily. Imagine walking into a granary each morning, heart quickened with dread, wondering if the night had spared your supplies. Relief came when everything appeared intact, but despair followed when damage was found. That daily uncertainty carved itself into memory. Families learned to hope cautiously, never too confident, always aware that misfortune might be waiting behind the door. The costs were not only emotional but also practical. Materials for defense consumed resources. Herbs had to be gathered and dried, wood replaced, traps repaired. Every reinforcement pulled time and goods away from other needs. Families accepted this burden because the alternative, hunger, was worse. Yet the quiet toll was undeniable. A cracked door frame might mean a day lost to repairs instead of weaving cloth. A spoiled sack might mean coins spent on food instead of tools. The defense of grain reshaped priorities in countless unseen ways. Communities shared this weight, and that sharing solved it. Villages often organized joint efforts to check large granaries, patching walls together, and pooling herbs. But shared burdens could also become shared blame. If food was lost, whispers began. Who was on watch last night? Whose trap failed? Whose repair gave way? These questions sowed tension, even as cooperation held people together. The fight against rats demanded unity, yet it also tested it. Children growing up amid this constant struggle absorbed the lessons early. They learned that vigilance was part of life, that survival required more than planting and harvesting. Some remembered their childhood not by games or stories, but by the sound of their parents rising in the night, lantern in hand, checking once more the bins of grain. Their memories held the rhythm of tapping walls, resetting traps, scattering herbs. The battle shaped not just survival, but identity. And yet, within this constant vigilance lay resilience. People discovered they could endure far more than they thought. Though they complained of sleeplessness, they continued to rise. Though they mourned spoiled grain, they replanted and rebuilt. Their ability to carry these costs without surrender became one of their greatest strengths. The story of defending food from rats is not only about clever tricks and inventive traps. It is about the quiet endurance of countless families who bore the costs without recognition. Their names are not written in chronicles. Their walls are not remembered in stone, but their persistence carried life forward, ensuring that each generation survived to teach the next. So why call this chapter The Quiet Costs of Constant Defense? Because the greatest weight of this struggle was not in the sudden losses, but in the daily grind, the weariness of never-ending vigilance. It teaches us that history is not only shaped by great moments, but also by the burdens people endured silently, without applause, yet with steady determination. And in the stillness of night, when the scratching began again, they rose once more, tired, anxious, but unbroken. For the food in those bins was not only grain, it was survival, memory, and hope. And for that the cost, though heavy, was always paid. Have you ever noticed how the simplest advice, shared quietly by someone older, often becomes the most valuable? Long before written guides or official instructions, the knowledge of how to guard food from rats lived in voices and memories. Parents taught children, neighbors shared tips, elders retold experiences. The wisdom passed down from generation to generation became as important as walls, traps, or herbs. Without it, each new family would have been forced to rediscover what others already knew. With it, survival became a chain linking past to future. This wisdom was practical, born from daily experience. A father might tell his son, "Never leave grain against the wall. They will find it first there." A grandmother might remind her granddaughter, "Scatter the ashes thick, and they will not cross." These small instructions, spoken casually while working, carried the weight of centuries. They were the inheritance of those who had faced hunger and refused to yield. Stories themselves became lessons. Families told tales of disastrous nights when negligence cost dearly. A careless latch led to a ruined store. A forgotten crack opened a path. These stories were not told to frighten, but to teach. Children listened, wide-eyed, and remembered. Fear of loss turned into caution, and caution turned into habit. Have you ever changed your behavior because of a story someone told, even if you never lived it yourself? That was how this knowledge worked. It planted seeds of vigilance in the imagination long before necessity demanded it. Communities created shared sayings, short phrases that captured rules of defense. High bins, dry grain reminded people to lift food from the ground and keep it safe from dampness that made it easier for rats to smell. Ash on the floor, peace at the door, encouraged scattering ashes to block paths. These sayings were repeated casually, sometimes even sung by children, embedding survival into culture itself. The wisdom passed down was not static. Each generation added to it, refining practices as new discoveries were made. If one family found that cedar shavings worked better than mint, that knowledge spread. If another discovered a trap design that caught more reliably, neighbors copied it. Slowly, a web of shared understanding grew, stronger than any single effort. This is why traditions of defense often varied by region. Local conditions shaped local solutions. Yet the principle remained the same. Survival rested on what was remembered and shared. The act of teaching itself carried comfort. To pass on wisdom was to feel that one's struggles had purpose beyond the present. Parents, tired from night vigils, took solace in knowing their children would inherit not only food, but the knowledge to protect it. Elders who had endured many lean years found dignity in telling younger generations what had worked before. The wisdom gave meaning to hardship, transforming personal battles into communal strength. Imagine a child crouching by a bin, watching an elder patch a crack with clay. The elder speaks slowly, explaining why the clay must be pressed firm, why no gap should remain. The child listens, perhaps impatient at first, but remembers the lesson years later when facing the same task. That moment of watching becomes memory, and memory becomes practice. In this way, the struggle against rats was never fought alone. It stretched backward into the past and forward into the future, each link forged by words. Even mistakes became part of the inheritance. Families admitted their failures so others would not repeat them. A mother might say, "Do not hang sacks too low." I learned that once, and they leapt to reach them. Such confessions turned losses into protection for others. The courage to share error was as valuable as the wisdom of success. This passing of knowledge shaped more than survival. It shaped identity. People saw themselves as guardians of food, not just for their own households, but for the chain of life stretching across generations. They defended not only their grain, but the lessons entrusted to them. To forget those lessons would be to dishonor those who had struggled before. To remember them was to continue the unbroken story of endurance. So why call this chapter The Wisdom Passed Down? Because without that flow of memory, the battle against rats would have been fought anew by each generation, with countless unnecessary losses. Instead, people built on one another's struggles, turning individual hardship into shared resilience. The wisdom whispered in kitchens, cellars, and granaries became the invisible wall stronger than any timber, the unseen trap sharper than any device. And in this way the scratching in the night, though constant, was never faced blindly. It was met with the steady confidence of people who remembered, who listened, who taught, and who endured. Have you ever watched water dripping across a floor and noticed how it always finds the smallest cracks, carving invisible paths through places you would never expect? Rats moved in much the same way. They did not simply wander randomly. They traced patterns, carved trails, and discovered hidden passages that humans rarely noticed until it was too late. Understanding these hidden paths became one of the most important parts of keeping food safe. For what good were walls, traps, or herbs if the enemy could always find another way in? Families quickly realized that rats favored the edges of rooms. Rarely did they dash across the center unless desperate. Instead, they hugged the walls, creeping in shadows where their whiskers brushed surfaces for guidance. This simple habit made them difficult to spot, but it also gave humans a clue. By focusing defenses along edges, people could block the paths most often traveled. Traps placed at mid-floor often remained empty, but traps placed against walls filled quickly. Knowledge of movement became the difference between failure and success. Rats also exploited vertical space. They climbed beams, rafters, even rough plaster, turning ceilings into highways. A family who thought their grain was safe in a loft sometimes awoke to find gnawed sacks above their heads. The invaders had climbed silently in the dark, dropping onto stores from above. To answer this, people smoothed beams with ash, polished rafters with oil, or lined supports with metal bands. Every climb had to be contested, every path broken. Burrowing was another weapon. Rats tunneled beneath granaries, digging into soil until they emerged inside. Villagers learned to watch for small mounds of displaced earth near walls, a telltale sign of intrusion. Some spread gravel or lime around foundations, materials less inviting to dig. Others dug trenches, filling them with water or ash, forming moats that slowed the advance. It was not always perfect, but it bought time. Have you ever noticed how even a tiny obstacle can discourage effort if it appears too troublesome? For rats, the same was often true. They also used human structures against their makers. Drains, ventilation holes, loose joints all became entryways. A gap meant for air might serve as a tunnel. A space left for moisture to escape became a rat's door. People had to balance necessity with defense, always calculating how to keep what they needed without opening paths for what they feared. The most cunning intruders learned to follow humans themselves. They watched where food was carried, where crumbs dropped, where barrels were opened. Their trails often mimicked human routines. To counter this, families altered habits, carrying food at different times, scattering waste far from homes, never letting crumbs remain. The daily rhythm of life bent under the pressure of constant adaptation. At night, when silence ruled, these hidden paths became more obvious to sharp ears. The faint tapping along rafters, the muted scratching beneath the floor, the tiny thud of a leap, all revealed routes unseen by day. Families listened carefully, mapping the enemy in their minds. They came from the north wall, someone might say in the morning, or I heard them above the beams. These observations guided repairs, determined trap placement, and shaped defenses. Children sometimes turned this vigilance into a game, tracing imagined lines across rooms, guessing where the rats had run. But for adults, it was no game. Each path was a threat that had to be blocked, each pattern a puzzle demanding a solution. To understand the enemy's movement was to gain a fragile sense of control. And yet, despite all efforts, the rats always seemed to find new paths. It was a reminder that the struggle had no end. Just as water always seeks another crack, so too did these creatures. The hidden paths could never be erased entirely, only managed, redirected, contested. That reality could be discouraging, but it also sharpened human ingenuity. People became students of the unseen, learning to notice the smallest signs, a faint smear along a wall, a disturbed patch of dust, a tiny hole at the floor's edge. These details, invisible to the untrained, became signals of invasion. The hidden paths of the intruders remind us that survival is not only about strength, but about perception. It is about seeing what is usually overlooked, hearing what others dismiss, noticing what seems unimportant. Families who mastered this vigilance had a better chance of saving their food. Those who ignored it often paid dearly. So why dwell on these secret trails? Because they reveal the true nature of the battle. It was not fought in open confrontation, but in shadows and silence, along paths few could see. The granary, the kitchen, the cellar, all became maps of invisible highways, where human foresight met animal persistence. And though the rats often returned, each blocked path was a small triumph, proof that the people watching the night had not surrendered. Have you ever noticed how problems seem to change with the seasons, even if the enemy remains the same? Rats were always present, but their hunger, their movements, and their boldness shifted with the rhythm of the year. Families and communities quickly realized that defending food was not a single, unchanging task. It was a cycle as varied and demanding as planting or harvest. To protect food, people had to read the seasons just as carefully as they read the skies. The danger grew most acute after harvest. Granaries brimmed with grain, pantries filled with sacks, and kitchens overflowed with goods. The sheer abundance drew rats from fields, forests, and neighboring homes. Imagine walking into a room piled high with treasure. That was what the harvest looked like to a rat. And so, just when families were most relieved by their bounty, they were also most vulnerable. Nights grew restless, ears strained for every sound, and hands worked tirelessly to patch walls and reset traps. The season of plenty became the season of greatest fear. As autumn deepened, the invaders grew bolder. The air cooled, and outdoor sources of food dwindled. Fields were empty, plants bare, insects vanished. The rats turned their full attention to human stores. The battle intensified. Families scattered stronger herbs, checked bins twice each night, and sometimes slept in shifts near the granary. The comfort of a full storehouse was always accompanied by the anxiety that it might not remain full for long. Winter carried its own challenges. Snow blanketed the ground, freezing streams and hiding scraps that might have fed the creatures. Hunger drove them to desperate measures. They gnawed at doors with renewed vigor, tunneled beneath frozen soil, and tested every crack with relentless persistence. Their very survival depended on reaching the warmth and abundance of human stores. For families, this meant constant vigilance in the harshest months, when fatigue and cold made every task heavier. Have you ever noticed how a problem feels harder to face when your body is already weary from other hardships? That was the truth of winter defense. Tired hands still had to hold firm, even when every breath clouded the air with frost. Spring brought brief relief. Fields sprouted once more, insects returned, and scraps of food reappeared in the wild. Rats spread out, their pressure on human stores easing. But spring also revealed the damage of the months before. Families opened bins to discover spoiled grain, checked sacks to find unseen holes, swept away droppings that had gathered despite all their efforts. Repairs filled the season, patching walls, replacing wood, clearing away nests. The work was less frantic, but no less important, for without repairs, the next cycle would bring disaster even sooner. Summer created a strange balance. Fields offered plenty, drawing rats back outdoors. But at the same time, food for humans had to be prepared and stored, and careless handling left opportunities for pests. A spilled basket of grain on a warm afternoon might attract intruders that later remembered the path back. Families remained cautious, even as their daily work turned more to planting, weeding, and tending animals. The rats might not press as hard in summer, but they never truly vanished. The seasonal cycle taught people lessons that shaped their defenses. They learned that vigilance had to rise and fall with the year, matching the movements of the enemy. They learned that preparation in spring and summer, repairing granaries, gathering herbs, strengthening traps, determined success in autumn and winter. To neglect repairs in the warm months was to invite ruin in the cold. The rhythm of the seasons was thus written into the rhythm of defense. Communities adapted together. Villages often organized collective repairs in spring, just as they organized collective harvests in autumn. Each family brought wood, clay, or herbs to the effort, ensuring that the communal stores stood strong before the hard months returned. Children were taught seasonal sayings. Fix the wall in spring, fill the trap in fall. Small reminders that kept the cycle alive in memory. The fear of winter loss also shaped how people valued their stores. A family might ration carefully, not only to stretch supplies, but to avoid attracting more attention than necessary. They learned that abundance could be dangerous if handled carelessly. Food was to be guarded as much in use as in storage. So why call this chapter Seasons of Plenty, Seasons of Fear? Because the struggle against rats was never steady. It swelled and ebbed with the year, teaching people to read not only the sky for weather, but the walls for signs of intrusion. The scratching in autumn was different from the scratching in spring. The silence of summer carried its own meaning, as did the frenzy of winter nights. The battle was not fought once, but lived again and again, season after season, year after year. And through this cycle, people endured. They adapted, repaired, and rose to meet each new challenge, proving that even the smallest enemy could not outlast the resilience of those determined to survive. Have you ever marveled at how persistence more than strength can sometimes conquer the most stubborn obstacle? A dripping leak wears away stone, a creeping vine splits a wall, a constant knock eventually breaks through a door. Rats embodied that persistence in their battle against human defenses. They did not need brilliance, only patience. They returned night after night, chewing, testing, probing, never discouraged by failure. For families trying to protect their food, this relentless patience was perhaps the greatest challenge of all. The gnawing was steady, almost mechanical. A rat could chew for hours, its teeth grinding against wood or plaster, wearing down resistance bit by bit. The sound itself was unnerving, a slow scrape that continued long after people struck the wall to scare it away. Even if the rat fled for a moment, it returned minutes later, resuming its steady work. Have you ever tried to sleep while a sound repeated endlessly, refusing to stop? That was the nightly reality for countless families. Each scrape was not just a noise, but a reminder that their stores were under siege. Walls and lids bore the scars of this persistence. Smooth wood became ragged with grooves. Clay patches crumbled under constant testing. Even iron-banded barrels showed marks where teeth had pressed again and again. It was as though the enemy carried infinite patience, while humans, weary from work and sleepless nights, carried only limited strength. The imbalance weighed heavily. People asked themselves, how do you fight an opponent that never tires? The answer lay not in brute force, but in matching persistence with ingenuity. Families learned that a single barrier could never hold forever. Instead, they layered defenses, forcing the rats to overcome not one obstacle, but several. A bin might be raised, sealed with clay, bound with metal, and surrounded with herbs. Each layer slowed the attack. Each bought time. The rat's patience was met with human foresight. The endless gnaw answered with endless adaptation. Still, the struggle wore on minds. Children sometimes cried at night, frightened not only by the sounds, but by the sense that the enemy could never be defeated. Parents comforted them with gentle words. The food will be safe, we are watching, we are strong. Yet deep down, they too felt the weight of doubt. When every night brought the same scratching, when every morning revealed new marks, it was easy to wonder if the battle could ever truly be won. And yet families endured. They accepted that victory did not mean eliminating the rats, but saving enough food to last. A sack partly gnawed was patched, its contents salvaged. A bin scarred by teeth still held grain. The patience of the enemy was real, but so was the resilience of the defenders. They learned to measure success not by perfection, but by survival. Communities responded collectively. If one household's stores suffered, neighbors helped with repairs, shared herbs, or lent traps. They knew that rats, relentless as they were, could overwhelm the careless, but struggled against united effort. The patience of the enemy forced the patience of the people, binding them together in common cause. The persistence of rats also taught humility. People realized that no defense was perfect, no wall unbreakable. Even the strongest stone granary bore the risk of intrusion. Accepting this truth did not mean surrender, but adaptation. It meant preparing for losses, rationing carefully, and never assuming complete safety. Survival lay not in denying weakness, but in working within it. So why call this chapter the relentless patience of the enemy? Because the rats taught humans a hard lesson, that persistence itself can be as powerful as strength. And yet, the story does not end with despair. For though the enemy pressed endlessly, the people responded with their own kind of persistence, one shaped by creativity, vigilance, and the quiet refusal to yield. In the end, The battle was never about final victory. It was about endurance. Each night the scratching returned, and each night the defenders rose again. The patience of the enemy was relentless, but so was the determination of those who guarded their food. And in that balance, fragile yet enduring, lay the story of survival across countless generations. Have you ever faced a problem so overwhelming that the only way to endure it was to count the little wins, to treasure the small successes that proved you were not powerless? That was the reality for families and villages who struggled each day and night to protect their food from rats. The scratching never stopped, the attacks never ended, and the fear of loss always returned with darkness. But amid this endless battle, people found hope in the small victories: a sack saved, a trap sprung, a night passed without damage. These tiny triumphs, repeated again and again, gave them the courage to continue. One victory might be as simple as waking to find the bins intact. After a long night of interrupted sleep, ears straining for every sound, families opened the granary door with dread. When no grain lay scattered, when no sacks sagged with holes, the relief was immense. Smiles spread across weary faces, children laughed, and for a moment the burden lifted. Have you ever felt joy at something remaining the same, simply because you feared it might be lost? That was the joy of those mornings, the happiness of safety preserved. Another victory came with the traps. A single rat caught meant one less to threaten the food. People took pride in their trap-making, boasting quietly when their designs worked well. Neighbors compared methods, each eager to learn from the other's success. These conversations carried not only advice but encouragement, proof that effort made a difference, that human wit could match animal persistence. Even herbs and smells brought victories. When storerooms stayed quiet after fresh mint or cedar was scattered, families felt renewed confidence. The scent itself became linked with safety, a reminder that the night could pass peacefully when defenses held. Children came to associate the aroma of herbs not only with fields or forests, but with the promise of full meals through the winter. Victories could be communal as well. In villages, when a large granary survived a season with minimal losses, the community celebrated. It meant every household would share in the security. Such triumphs were not marked by feasts or songs, but by quiet gratitude, by the knowledge that hunger had been held at bay for another year. The importance of these victories was not only practical, but emotional. They reminded people that persistence mattered, that their efforts were not in vain. Without such encouragement, despair could have crushed the will to continue. Imagine fighting the same battle every night, with no sign of progress. How long could you endure? The small victories kept hope alive, showing that even against a tireless enemy, humans could win enough to survive. These moments of relief also offered time for reflection. Families spoke softly to one another, reminding themselves why they endured. Parents told children, "This is why we patch the cracks, why we set the traps, why we stay awake at night." Such words turned victories into lessons, binding the next generation to the same vigilance. And if you are listening now, noticing how these small triumphs shaped lives, perhaps you see the quiet beauty in their persistence. These stories remind us that history is not only about great triumphs, but also about small, steady successes that carried people through hard times. If you'd like to hear more of these overlooked battles of survival, you may gently subscribe, So each story arrives as faithfully as these memories once passed from parent to child. The truth is, the war against rats was never truly won. The scratching always returned, the gnawing always resumed. But people did not measure victory in final endings. They measured it in the meals that reached their tables, in the seasons they endured, in the children who grew strong because enough food was saved. Survival itself became the greatest victory of all. So why call this chapter Hope in the Small Victories? Because it was those tiny triumphs that gave people strength. They taught that success need not be total to be meaningful, that endurance itself is a kind of victory. And through these countless small wins, repeated night after night, season after season, families and communities carried themselves forward into the future. Have you ever tried holding a heavy object for far longer than you expected, only to realize that the weight didn't seem unbearable at first, but over time it wore you down until every muscle trembled? That was what it felt like for families and communities to live under the constant burden of guarding their food against rats. It was not one dramatic event, not a single desperate night, but an unending weight pressing on them day after day, night after night. The burden began with attention. Every sound, every movement, every shadow in the corner carried meaning. A faint scratch at the wall was not dismissed as background noise. It was cause for concern. A rustle in the straw might be wind, or it might be claws. People lived in a state of alertness, their senses sharpened by necessity. This constant vigilance wore on nerves. Sleep was restless, conversations interrupted, thoughts distracted. Imagine always having to keep part of your mind fixed on danger, even while working, eating, or resting. That was the burden of constant watch. Tasks that might have been simple became complicated by worry. Carrying grain to a bin was not just a matter of pouring it in. It was an act of calculation. Was the lid strong enough? Was the bin raised high enough? Was the wall behind it matched well? Cooking with flour required checking that the sack had not been chewed overnight. Preparing a meal became not only about feeding the family, but about confirming that food was safe, unspoiled, uncontaminated. Even eating carried the quiet question: did the night leave enough untouched? The watch extended into the darkest hours. Families rose from their beds to listen, to strike walls, to check traps. A father might sit in silence by a lantern, ears tuned for the faintest sound. A mother might pace softly through the storeroom, scattering fresh herbs at the base of bins. Children, though frightened, were sometimes tasked with keeping watch for part of the night, learning early that survival was a shared responsibility. These vigils did not last for a week or two, but for entire seasons. The exhaustion became part of life. Communities bore the weight together, but even shared burdens did not lessen the fatigue. In villages, watch rotations for communal granaries stretched through long winters. One family after another took their turn, huddling in cloaks against the cold, lanterns flickering at their sides, ears straining for movement. The hours dragged, interrupted only by the sudden thud of a rat scurrying across the floor or the snap of a trap. Those on watch carried the knowledge that if they faltered, the whole village might suffer. Responsibility pressed as heavily as sleeplessness. The burden also carried into thought. People worried constantly about what might happen if they failed. A gnawed sack could mean a week of hunger. A breached granary could mean sickness or famine. Anxiety gnawed at them as persistently as the rats gnawed at their walls. It was not enough to build defenses. They had to live within a state of readiness, always prepared for the worst. Yet, despite the heaviness of this burden, people found ways to endure. They developed routines to lighten the strain. Duties were rotated among family members, so no one carried the weight alone. Stories were told during long night watches to pass the hours, turning dread into distraction. Children were comforted with sayings and songs, transforming fear into lessons. In this way, the burden was shared, reshaped, and made bearable. Still, the cost was undeniable. Tired eyes, weary hands, distracted minds, all became common. The work of farming, weaving, and tending animals suffered under the strain of sleeplessness. Mistakes in daily labor sometimes traced back to long nights spent chasing rats from bins. The burden of constant watch seeped into every aspect of life, reminding people that survival required sacrifice not only of resources but of rest itself. So why call this chapter The Burden of Constant Watch? Because it reveals the true weight of the struggle. It was not only about the grain saved or the traps sprung, but about the endless pressure of vigilance that shaped lives. Families did not simply defend their food. They lived in defense, each day and night pressed by the awareness that safety was never complete. And yet, within that burden lay a quiet strength. For though they bent under the weight, they did not break. They carried it forward, generation after generation, proving that even the heaviest watch could be endured when survival demanded it. Have you ever noticed how silence, when it follows noise, carries its own tension? A ticking clock that suddenly stops makes you look up. A dripping faucet that ceases makes you listen harder. For people centuries ago, the scratching of rats was a nightly soundtrack, steady and unnerving. But sometimes, just as suddenly as it began, the sound would stop. And that silence, sharp, heavy, uncertain, was almost more unsettling than the noise itself. The silence could mean many things. It might signal success. The rats had fled, startled by a noise or discouraged by a trap. Families sometimes dared to hope that quiet meant safety, that the food was untouched, that vigilance had worked. But silence could also mean the opposite. The rats were waiting, listening, planning a new path. Or worse, it could mean they had already reached the food, and the destruction was happening in stillness, hidden beyond sight. That uncertainty made silence a double-edged presence, both comforting and unnerving. Families grew skilled at reading silence as carefully as sound. A long stretch of quiet after a loud knock on the wall was taken as victory, the rats frightened into retreat. But a sudden pause and scratching, followed by faint movement elsewhere, signaled danger. Parents would rise from bed, lantern in hand, to check bins, certain the enemy had only shifted positions. Have you ever woken from half-sleep to a silence so strange that you knew something was happening, even if you couldn't yet see it? That was the nightly intuition of countless households. The silence also carried emotional weight. After hours of listening to gnawing and scurrying, a moment of peace felt like a blessing. Families rested their ears, their hearts slowed, and they let their eyes close, hoping for sleep. But often, the relief was brief. The scratching returned, more unnerving for having paused. Children learned early that silence was not always safety. They lay awake, waiting for the next sound, knowing it would come. In granaries, silence could mean traps had been sprung. A sudden end to noise often sent watchers hurrying to check, eager for proof that their defenses had worked. Finding a rat in a bucket or cage was both grim and satisfying. It meant the silence carried weight, the absence of noise because one more enemy had been removed. These small triumphs gave people the strength to face the next night. The silence shaped habits of watchfulness. Families did not only listen for noise, they listened for its absence. A room that had been busy with scurrying one night but fell strangely quiet the next raised questions. Had the defenses grown stronger, or were the intruders growing bolder and finding hidden ways? Suspicion filled the stillness, keeping people alert. The absence of sound was as much a signal as its presence. This uneasy relationship with silence changed the way people experienced nights. Stillness, which might have been restful, became heavy with meaning. Families measured time, not by clocks, but by rhythms of scratching and silence. Their nights were marked by cycles: noise, pause, noise again. The unpredictability kept them tense, reminding them that the battle was always ongoing. And yet, silence sometimes brought genuine peace. When stores were well guarded, walls thick, and traps effective, the scratching might fade for days. Those nights felt miraculous. People woke refreshed, amazed at having slept without interruption. They spoke of it with relief, as though a storm had passed. Even brief reprieves gave them strength to continue. So why call this chapter "The Silence After the Scratching"? Because it captures the strange, double-sided truth of the struggle. Silence was not simply absence, it was presence in another form, carrying questions, fears, and hopes. It was a reminder that safety was never certain, that victory was always fragile. But it also showed that even in the most anxious of times, people found meaning in the smallest changes, listening so closely to the night that even quiet itself became a teacher. And through those lessons they endured. They learned to balance fear with patience, relief with caution. The silence after the scratching may never have meant complete safety, but it meant the battle continued, and so did the will to fight it. Have you ever lived with a worry so constant that it changed the way you thought, the way you moved, even the way you rested? That was the quiet reality for countless families whose lives were shadowed by the nightly threat of rats. The creatures stole not only food, but also peace of mind. Their presence weighed on people in ways both visible and invisible, leaving a hidden price of fear that shaped daily existence as much as hunger or labor ever did. The fear began with sound. Every faint scratching in the dark stirred unease. People learned to wake at the lightest noise, their ears tuned as finely as an animal's. Sleep was shallow, broken by vigilance. Dreams were often interrupted, not by thunder or voices, but by the steady scrape of unseen teeth. Over weeks and months, this nightly tension wore on health, leaving eyes tired, hands clumsy, minds clouded. Have you ever tried working after too many nights of broken rest? Imagine that exhaustion stretched across a whole season, and you will glimpse the toll of this fear. Fear also changed behavior. Families carried food more carefully, hid crumbs more quickly, and moved through their homes with constant awareness. Children were taught to avoid leaving scraps behind, to close lids firmly, to watch corners. Even play was shaped by caution. as little ones grew up under reminders of what might happen if they were careless. In this way, fear etched itself into habits, turning ordinary actions into acts of defense. Conversations carried the weight of anxiety. A mother might ask, "Did you check the bins?" A father might reply, "I patched the crack, but I heard them near the door." These exchanges were not simply practical. They were rituals of reassurance, attempts to soothe worry with words. But beneath them always lingered the thought, what if it is not enough? The uncertainty gnawed at minds just as the rats gnawed at wood. Fear affected how food was valued. A sack of grain was not just nourishment. It was security against the unknown. Losing even a small portion felt catastrophic. People spoke of ruined sacks with the same grief others reserved for greater disasters. They knew the difference between survival and hunger could rest on a single bin. That awareness magnified every loss, deepening the fear of what might come next. The hidden price also showed in how people treated one another. Fear sometimes united families, drawing them closer in shared vigilance. But it also caused tension. When food was spoiled, blame fell quickly. Who forgot to latch the door? Who failed to scatter the herbs? Who slept when they should have listened? Arguments flared, trust wavered, and even strong households felt strain. Villages, too, were tested. A communal granary that suffered intrusion might spark suspicion between families. Fear did not always divide, but when it did, its cost was steep. And yet, fear was not only destructive. In its own way, it sharpened resilience. Families learned discipline because of it. Communities learned cooperation because of it. Children grew cautious and resourceful under its weight. The price of fear was high, but it was not entirely wasted. It forged habits of care that carried people through crises, teaching them that constant vigilance could mean the difference between want and plenty. Still, the emotional toll cannot be ignored. Imagine the sigh of relief each morning when the granary door creaked open and the food remained safe. That sigh was not only gratitude, but release from hours of tension. Daylight brought respite, but night always promised its return. The cycle was endless. Fear, relief, fear again. It shaped not only survival, but the very rhythm of life. So why call this chapter The Hidden Price of Fear? Because the struggle against rats was never only about the food they destroyed. It was about the peace of mind they stole, the rest they disturbed, the suspicion they bred. Fear was as constant as the scratching in the walls, an invisible presence shaping every decision. And though people endured it with remarkable strength, the weight they carried was real. In the end, their survival was not only about walls, traps, or herbs. It was about the ability to live with fear without letting it break them. They bore its price quietly, generation after generation, proving that even under constant unease, life could go on, meals could be shared, and hope could persist. Have you ever thought about how much of life is guided not by what we see, but by what we hear? The crunch of footsteps on gravel tells us someone approaches. The creak of a door tells us it has not been shut properly. For people centuries ago, trying to defend their food from rats, sound was their most important ally. Eyes could not pierce the darkness of cellars and granaries, but ears could. Survival depended on listening closely, interpreting every scrape, rustle, and scurry. The sound of survival was the language of the night. The first sound was gnawing, steady, sharp, almost rhythmic. Families knew it too well. A rat's teeth grinding against wood or sackcloth carried through quiet rooms like a slow drumbeat. It was both warning and threat, telling people exactly where their stores were being tested. A father lying awake could point to the wall and whisper, "There, behind the bin." Mothers woke their children, not with lullabies, but with warnings. "Listen, do you hear it? That's where they'll come through." The gnawing was both hated and necessary. Without it, people would not know where to direct their defenses. The second sound was scurrying, quick, light, darting across floors. It was the noise of a raid, the brief dash from shadow to shadow. Some compared it to the rustling of leaves or the flutter of paper, but once learned it could never be mistaken. Children who grew up hearing it could recognize it instantly, even decades later. Scurrying meant the enemy was already inside, moving fast, searching for food. The moment people heard it, they knew action was required. The third sound was silence, but a silence filled with tension. After long minutes of scratching and scurrying, sudden stillness set hearts pounding. Was the rat gone, or had it found a way in? People strained their ears, holding their breath, waiting for the next clue. Sometimes the silence broke with the clatter of a trap, and relief flooded the room. Other times it ended with the faint tear of cloth or the collapse of a bin. Silence was not empty. It was a signal, a moment heavy with meaning. Families became skilled interpreters of this nocturnal language. They could tell by rhythm whether a gnaw was at the surface or deep in the wall, whether scurrying meant a single rat or many. They learned to distinguish between the bold thuds of larger creatures and the lighter taps of smaller ones. Listening became an art, practiced every night, refined across lifetimes. The sound of survival shaped daily habits. Families positioned their sleeping spaces close enough to storerooms to hear activity. They left gaps in walls or floors, not for ventilation, but for sound to carry through. Watchers sat in silence, ears straining, knowing that sound would warn them before sight ever could. Survival was not about waiting for proof. It was about acting at the first hint of trouble. In villages, sound shaped cooperation. Neighbors banged pans or clapped boards, creating sudden noise to drive rats back. The echoes carried across alleys, signaling that others were awake and vigilant. A shared language of sound united them. The thud of stone on floor, the slam of a door, the shout of warning. Each sound meant food was being defended, and others listened with sympathy, knowing they might face the same battle soon. Even tools relied on sound. Traps were valued not only for what they caught, but for what they announced. The clatter of wood snapping shut, the thump of a falling lid, the splash of a bucket, each one signaled victory. Families woke at these noises with relief, sometimes smiling in the dark, comforted that the night had brought one fewer threat. The sound of survival was also memory. Children remembered the scratching of their youth, carrying it with them into adulthood. Some recalled it with dread, others with a kind of grim nostalgia. The noises became part of their identity, shaping how they understood vigilance, patience, and resilience. For them, the sounds of rats were not just background noise. They were the soundtrack of survival. So why call this chapter The Sound of Survival? Because in the long war between humans and rats, sound was the invisible weapon that guided defense. It told people where to act, when to act, and whether their efforts succeeded. It was a constant companion of vigilance, both feared and trusted. And though the scratching, scurrying, and silences may seem small to us now, for those who lived through them, they were as meaningful as any trumpet of war or bell of warning. They were the music of persistence, the rhythm of survival, the sound of life continuing against all odds. Have you ever wondered why certain struggles of the past remain remembered even when the details fade? People forget dates, they forget names, but they rarely forget the things that shaped daily life. For countless generations, the effort to keep food safe from rats was one of those struggles. It was not written in grand histories or carved into stone, but it was lived night after night, season after season. It left its mark not only on the food people ate, but on the way they thought, the way they listened, the way they taught their children. And though the scratching may have grown fainter with time, the memory of that struggle endures. The endurance began with stories. Families passed down memories of clever traps, of near disasters, of narrow escapes. A father might recall how his own parents stayed awake through a stormy winter, guarding the grain that kept the family alive. A grandmother might smile as she told of the time mint leaves kept the storeroom silent for weeks. These stories were not told for entertainment, but for survival, and yet they became part of the fabric of memory. Children grew up hearing them as often as they heard tales of harvests or markets. In this way, the fight against rats became part of the rhythm of history itself. The endurance also lived in habits. Even long after stronger buildings and better tools were introduced, people continued to check walls for cracks, scatter herbs in corners, and raise bins from the floor. The practices, born of necessity, became tradition. They reminded each generation that vigilance was part of life, even when the immediate threat seemed less. Have you ever kept a habit your parents taught you, even if the reason feels less urgent now? That was how the memory of this struggle lingered, not always through fear, but through the steady inheritance of caution. Communities remembered together. Villages recalled the winters when losses were high, the seasons when vigilance spared them from hunger. These memories shaped how they organized labor, how they trusted one another, how they valued food. To waste a kernel of grain was not only careless but disrespectful to the generations who had fought to preserve it. The memory of the struggle shaped values as much as it shaped actions. The endurance stretched into identity. People saw themselves not only as farmers, bakers, or millers, but as guardians. To be a provider was not only to gather food, but to defend it. The fight against rats wove itself into what it meant to care for a family, a household, a village. Even without speaking of it, people carried the pride of survival, the quiet knowledge that they had endured where others might have faltered. And as centuries passed, the struggle softened into reflection. What had once been nights of sleepless fear became stories told with a certain calm, even nostalgia. The scratching in the walls was no longer only a threat, but also a reminder of how much had been overcome. The persistence of rats had tested the persistence of humans, and the humans had endured. That endurance, more than any trap or herb, was the true legacy. Even now, if you pause in an old farmhouse, you might notice raised bins or smooth beams, echoes of those defenses. If you listen closely in the silence of night, you might hear the faint scurry of a creature in the walls. And in that moment you might feel connected across centuries to those who lay awake listening to the same sounds, shaping their lives around the same vigilance. The memory of the struggle lives not only in books or stories, but in the habits of watchfulness that remain with us still. And if you've stayed with this long journey, listening to these quiet histories, you've kept alive the memory of countless ordinary lives whose endurance shaped the world in ways often forgotten. If you'd like to continue receiving stories like these, you may gently subscribe so each new chapter of history finds its way to you, just as these memories once passed from parent to child. So why call this chapter The Enduring Memory of the Struggle? Because it reminds us that survival is not only about food or shelter, but about the stories we carry forward. The scratching in the night, the herbs on the floor, the traps by the wall, all of these were more than defenses. They were threads woven into the fabric of human endurance, reminders that even the smallest daily battles shape who we are. And so the story closes not with final victory, for the struggle never truly ended, but with the quiet triumph of memory. The people endured, the food was saved, and the lessons were passed on. And through those lessons their resilience lives on, steady and unbroken, like a lantern glowing softly against the darkness.